Okay, so this is part 2 of my reading and commentary of Proverbs chapter 20. And I believe that I had left off last time with verse 5. And so I will continue this time with verse 6. Most men will proclaim every one his own goodness, but a faithful man who can find? Okay, so before I get into this, it's important to set the ground rules, so to speak. And what I mean by that is a recognition of the approach thus far, of the practice that has been developed over the months, and that is to take every verse, no matter how simple it may seem, as an opportunity to dig into the unintelligible sphere, or the sphere that is unknown, that is yet to be perceived. In a like manner, we can imagine an illustration in which we have a blank canvas. We are given this verse as a direction, sort of as a vector, and it is our responsibility to paint what comes to mind, again, under the guidance of the verse. The last thing I would say is that it is not a simple matter of just painting what we might see at the surface, but yet dip our sensory apparatus beneath the surface such that we are able to appreciate the depth. Most men will proclaim every one his own goodness. So this is where we begin. So fundamental to the beginning of this verse, the first half, is what it means for a man to proclaim his own goodness. So let's begin with his own goodness. Now, at the beginning of these episodes, at the beginning of a new day, perhaps of the same episode, it's often difficult to really pick a starting place, because there are many potential avenues, there are many potential ways that one can interpret the verse, although the general themes and patterns may be consistent among differing paths that have been taken, different analogies used. I think the first path to take here is an examination of principle, since we are talking about goodness. Now, I think there's an interesting analogy when we discuss the foundations of a house. The foundations, of course, are fundamental to supporting its structure. Perhaps I think of a strong steel I-beam that takes a lot of the load of the house, much of the load of the house. Perhaps there are a few of these that support the house in conjunction with other elements. But the point here being is that the I-beam is fundamental to the foundation. And along with being fundamental, it is also something that goes unnoticed. Or rather, it is noticed insofar as the house has some continuity, but in terms of its explicit form, it is implicit. It is implicit until one is faced to understand that there is some defect with the I-beam, or with some other fundamental aspect of the foundation. Also, by extension, it may not be the case that a person comes to understand the importance of the I-beam through defect, but rather through want of understanding, desire of improving the foundation. In both instances, what we are examining is a structure that was a fundamental structure that was little known, and yet so fundamental to our everyday experience. And upon this reflection, upon this understanding, the question is, what can we gain from it? Now, of false proclamation, we understand that no good can come of this. There's no sense. There's no logical continuity besides the superficial distinction that one can gain from superficial appearances. But much like the foundations of a house, if it is poorly established, the house will begin to show cracks, signs of that weak foundation. The man's soul, man's heart, I think, follows a similar pattern, a similar trajectory. But to return to this examination of the I-beam, of the fundamentals, of goodness, we can say of somebody's moral stance, of their moral uprightness. And as we consider matters of morality, what we are concerned with here is the principles that underlie right and wrong behavior, right and wrong relationality, right and wrong perception. In the first instance, what we recognize is that there is, we can say, a form of both, that of goodness, that of badness. Of both, we can say that there is some source, right? If the form is to be a principle of something, and a principle, if this is to be of Latin origin, to describe the beginning, the foundation, the source again. In our modern tongue, which it has not changed all that much, perhaps we've come to understand principle as a fundamental truth. It is a rule, it's a strong belief. The concept of the before, I think, is interesting. Perhaps I'll place that as a bookmark here to come back to. But of the generative, of the beginning, what relationship does the beginning have to our fundamental principles? What does the beginning have to the form of goodness, to the form of badness, to the I-beam that is within our crawl spaces? Now, of material matters of this I-beam, of its beginning, it is of some want, of some desire. That want and that desire, perhaps when it is made, is expressed as potential. It is made, it is refined, generally to satisfy the purposes of bearing a load. But again, the context in which it is used perhaps may vary slightly. It can be used in a home, it can be used commercially, etc. As the life of the I-beam matures, and it moves through the industrial process, the decisions for which the I-beam's purpose is to depend on is made after its birth. But its birth is largely grounded, regardless of the condition where it may find itself, it is largely grounded in the idea that it will bear some load, that it will accept, it's a strange way to put it, but accept a certain degree of responsibility. Now, of course, this is a reference to the prior episode in which I was discussing responsibility. This comes from verse 4, "The sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold, therefore he shall beg in harvest and have nothing." There's a strong vector towards responsibility in that verse. And so perhaps of the good, what can be said? Perhaps there is more to be said of the generation, the procedure that underlies the I-beam. But to move to the goodness and of badness for a moment, in a like manner, I think, if we imagine goodness as the sort of load-bearing component of the soul, that it accepts certain responsibilities. And we also understand, just like the I-beam, in its inception, its goodness is not particularly directed until it finds its place, it finds its relationship. Just like the I-beam might find a relationship with a buyer that then sells to a contractor that is building some structure. Goodness and perhaps badness in this way are propagated through the intentional sphere, through the conscious sphere, through the purposeful sphere, just like the I-beam is transmitted through the material sphere. But again, because of the human interaction, the heavenly is brought down to the earthly, such that this steel component is brought up from the earth. It is refined. It is made into this thing for heavenly purposes, as we can say metaphorically. Goodness is inherently a heavenly principle, and the same with badness. And so the reverse must be true here. The I-beam, the steel, the iron ore that is drawn from the earth, up to something that is going to bear the load of a house for which we can bear and raise children, have a successful family. This is very purposeful, but this is emergent. What we're talking about now with goodness and badness is top down. This descends to us from the heavenly. And it doesn't necessarily have to follow the path down into the earth, to the iron ore. Perhaps there is some connection there, but this is not the direction that I want to go at the moment. And I think at this moment it is important to be weary, to be alert against the dangers of what I have been calling self or auto-actualization, which is a self-divination, which I think can be mistakenly seen. It's a temptation of the self that everything revolves around the way I, as a man, experience reality. And in a sense, there must be some connection to that which is unknown, certainly, but it's more than that. It's an understanding, a humility, such that the deception that one is at risk for by falling into that pit of the self that would delight one to darkness. This sort of thing needs to be recognized at the minimum if we are to discuss matters of how goodness descends to man. Because although man, in the former instance, that of the I-beam, if he is to placed this material substance together in such a way that he has designed something for his own purposes, we have to recognize that perhaps there are purposes from without him that are designed to shape him. And in a like manner, although he be a heavenly creature mixed with this earthly existence, he is acted upon by that conscious overstructure, for which perhaps in some sense we are a substructure. We are in the image of God, we do produce this light, we do produce this understanding. We do have the ability to raise things up in the meaning sphere and the heavenly sphere. But of goodness, much like iron ore, we are not the creators of. And so as this goodness comes down to us, perhaps as man's hand comes down to the iron ore, and since I'm not a polytheist, and I don't believe in the gods that are vindictive, manipulative, although they certainly do exist in a certain sense, that they do have sway over man, that from without him, or that, for that matter, from within him, that deceives himself, takes hold of him, such that there is a part of mind, the willful part of mind, that is able to correct and move in such a way that he is his purpose is directed towards that which calls him. Perhaps this is a kind of a vague way to describe it, but calls him as if the I-beam could hear where it is called to bear load for good purposes. If an I-beam is used for setting up a meth house, this perhaps serves some purpose, but it is not a good purpose. It's eventually going to destroy lives and destroy communities. Much like the situation of man, if he's going to serve to bear some responsibility in relation to some end or to some good as he perceives according to his will, he ought to take that responsibility and to accept that there are different levels of goodness. Part of that has to do with the nature of his perception, for he cannot immediately see the highest of the goodness, and sort of in the C.S. Lewis sense, badness or wrongfulness is just a misplaced good in the eyes of man. So I think we're at a point of divergence here. There are two different ways that we can go. In the first instance, I think that we can examine the path that examines directed goodness outside of the will of man. And then the other path being goodness that is directed from within, that sort of grabs goodness from without, integrates it kind of in a selfish manner, and then decides where he shall go based on his concern or based on what he perceives to be utmost. Now the former I have some difficulty with understanding, at least, exactly how a man would give himself up so highly to that form of directed goodness that he sacrifices, in some sense, a large portion of his will. Of course, he retains his will because he has to have his will in order to accept that path in the first place. But once he's accepted that path and he's on it, how exactly that goodness comes down to him such that he avoids the pitfalls is difficult to understand. Perhaps it's difficult for everybody to understand. But in the latter example of man understanding in the first instance the existence of goodness, and also a strong sense of will that in every step of the way he becomes this rational, precise creature, that at every moment of goodness he tries to connect it for what he allows himself to be able to know based on certain standards or certain thresholds, perhaps. And here I think of a methodology such as a rigid scientific approach to understanding, which is useful. Again, I don't think it saves him from the pitfalls of misunderstanding, and also by virtue of the sheer volume of information that is required to make an inference, I think he limits himself, he reduces himself. In terms of the collective, perhaps this, if extended long enough, would provide some results of greater interest than that of the selfless. But there's a part of me that doubts that of the selfless, once the self has recognized itself and understands that there's no way out of its own indecency than by sacrificing itself to that which can guide it from without, he then may find his ultimate purpose, since again he has given himself up. But perhaps I'm getting too far into the weeds. And so of goodness, I think we have at least some illustration that has been created. Most men will proclaim every one his own goodness. And here we see the proverbial relativism sneaking in. Now, what do I mean by that? Because by saying most men will proclaim every one his own goodness, it is saying that of the majority of conscious agents, their relationship to goodness is, at least in part because of this, auto-actualization. Most men will proclaim every one his own goodness. I think the key words there are his own goodness, as though that goodness that has been given to him belongs to him. It is a part of him now. It is that self-goodness. That the self can be good, but self-goodness in the sense that this is held. Now this is a generative principle, that the I-beam always existed within the self. That principle of goodness now is man's goodness. Now, there are ways in which we can, I think, understand goodness that belong to man, but also is not subject to this self-actualization. But in here, the relativism implies that between men, each can have a different distinction of what goodness is. Moreover from that, I think this implies also that there can be a deceptive element, that there is a conception of goodness within him that is greater than his actual goodness. And his actual goodness is something that is determined outside of him. Now he can better understand his goodness by exposing the self to that type of judgment. But what this, I think, creates is a superficial architecture. It creates weak foundations, because the principle and that which is generative of goodness is now seen as some selfish thing. It is found within the self to be drawn up to relate to others. And then this is followed up by the second half, which is a question. But a faithful man who can find. So among the relativism, where is the man that proclaims faith to the goodness outside of himself, rather than proclaim to others the goodness that is from within himself? It's an interesting rhetorical question. The just man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. Now, of the word integrity, I think it's appropriate to discuss the etymological chain. From the Proto-Indo-European root, we have teg, Old Latin tegere, which means to cover, Latin integer, which means whole or entire, integritas, from the Latin soundness, integrity, Middle French, intégrité, Middle English, intégrité, Modern English, integrity. Now what's interesting is that the word integer I had not readily recognized as being a part of the word integrity. But thinking about it in this way, and following that etymological chain, I begin to see a little bit more clearly that what we are discussing here has to do with unity, it has to do with wholeness. We are not, as we placed our attention on briefly, overly concerning ourselves with that of partiality. Although recognizing it exists, we are quite concerned with, again, that unity. So we must keep in mind here, we are considering from the root, to cover, to protect, and regarding the totality of the word, we are considering integrity as a state of being unbroken, consistent, and unified. Now suddenly, for me, this verse sort of opens up, because immediately integrity in this sense, being able to draw exactly what it means for a just man to walk in his integrity, or to walk in his wholeness, and cover the entirety of him, to walk unified with himself. It's sort of a strange way to think about this word. Now, of course, in the modern context, integrity means the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness, or the state of being whole and undivided. So, modern definition is quite similar from that etymological chain. Sometimes the contemporary definition has trace elements from older versions of the word, or from its roots, but doesn't remain entirely the same. Here, I think we have a fair consistency from its origins, that of the state of being whole, undivided. So if we consider integrity as a state of being, perhaps as a position of the soul, we have to necessarily ask ourselves, what does it mean then for that state of being to be undivided, especially considering the great concern of the Proverbs and of the Psalms and of Job, certainly, and of many other places in the Bible, the dangers against selfishness, against wickedness, the delusion that one can suffer when they do not surrender certain aspects of the self so that they may be properly unified with that divine source outside of them. And the thing that is, I think, worth consideration is the highlighting of the verse, the just man walks in his integrity, his honesty, his principles, his wholeness or undividedness. Now there are two more words that we have to discuss here, I think, before we can link integrity to the purpose of this verse. And again, I think one of the issues that I would like to solve here is the potential of this self-delusion that can come from one's own self-centeredness, or again, self or auto-actualization. The just man walks in his integrity. Okay, so let's move now to the word walk, or more specifically, what it means to walk within something. Now, if I'm going to walk within my room, or if I'm going to walk within a city, if I'm going to walk within a gymnasium, here we have the representation of the spatial dimension. And if there's a parallel that we can draw between the spatial dimension and the metaphorical, we have to examine what it means for us to be within. And certainly there is an interrelatedness here. The metaphorical is laid on top of the spatial. So let's pick one of those examples. Let's say I'm going to walk within a city. And perhaps I'll take two examples. One more immediate, that of the room, and then of the city. But of the city, if I'm going to walk within it, what does that mean? Well, it means that I, myself, spatially, am within a certain geographical location. But it's more than that, because the city is both a geographical representation and also a construct. The construct is beyond just its literal, perhaps that's not the right word, because if we say city, and I say the literal city, the literal is according to the word, or what is literal is according to the word. And if I say city, if it's literally the city, then we have to literally recognize the word. That means the totality, the integrity of the word, the unity of the word. And if we are to do so, we examine matters greater than its geographical position. And so what other matters do we examine when we consider a city? Well, we can consider a culture, we can consider a people, we can consider a language, which I guess would go within that culture. We can think of particular architecture. There's a lot to be said, I think, of culture. I think I'm trying to think of many examples, but many examples can certainly be fit within that of culture, or the spirit, we can say, of a city. Now, I happen to live close to Chicago. Chicago has an interesting spirit. It is something that is not one can control. It is something that has a sort of movement and sway of its own because of its constituent elements. And what's interesting is that a city can have a reputation for being corrupt, It can have a reputation for being violent, and yet it doesn't take one person to be violent to make the city violent, unless it's an extreme event perhaps, but in the case of Chicago, this is certainly not the case. This is perpetual of its corruption. This is long-standing of its violence. It is also long-standing from the days of the mob to the current disintegration of the family and community on the southern and western aspects of the city. So we have this understanding, this idea of the integrity of a word, or the integrity of, in the specific instance of the city. Now, to get more to the point, what exactly does it mean to be walking within that thing? Well, I think if we are going to say literally, if we are literally going to be walking within the city, it is, as I just said, we carry ourselves through a specific place, spatially. That is one dimension of the city. Another dimension is that spiritual domain of the city. We can represent a temporal dimension, perhaps. But the point is, with all the varying dimensions and ways in which we can see the city, we see that among all of the dimensions, when we add them together, they create a whole. They create an integer. And they form an integral part of what makes the city a city. And therefore, what forms, I think, is the integrity of a city. Now, from its wholeness, we necessarily, I think, can examine its fundamental parts, of which I think we move into that secondary definition, or primary. It's probably primary in most people's minds, and that is the quality of being honest and having strong moral principles, moral uprightness. In the case of morals, in the case of uprightness, what we're really considering here is the principles which we have already discussed are relational. Not that they are relative, but that they are bound within a relationship. Like, I don't know why the chain as an analogy is coming up a lot here, but I think the chain is a good analogy, such that for something to be integral, perhaps, for something to have continuity in terms of the chain, all links must be intact. They must communicate with the adjacent links. And in this way, they form what we consider that chain, and it can fulfill its purpose. It's not the case that a chain is only manifest. It's only something that is considered to exist because each constituent element, each individual chain, it seems like there's an arbitrary placement, which, okay, if we could say that there is, but that doesn't mean anything. What means something is, again, that continuity of the chain, that they are in relationship such that they can fulfill a purpose. So I think by this logic and by this reasoning, we have made the first step to understanding the potential pitfall that this verse brings up, which is his integrity, the individual's integrity, the subject's potential for that internal delusion. Not saying that his integrity is his delusion. I'm just saying that the opportunity for self-deception exists if the word his implies his without the relationship. Just like in the chain. If he finds himself How to describe this? So let's start in this direction. If he finds himself within himself, and that's it, he is not necessarily considered integral or an integer. He is not the chain. I think his integrity implies he being the link in that chain. The integral, the totality. And this includes the meaning of integrity as that of moral principle as it does of a state of being whole and undivided. Because, I've already said this, but I'll say it again, in order for a principle to stand, let's say the principle of goodness to stand, it must be in relation to the source of that goodness. Now, as I was saying, this man, this hypothetical man, if he is to be internalized, he is not within his integrity because he himself becomes a link but not a part of the chain. And of course, one link we don't consider a chain unless it is in relationship to other links in that chain. And again, it is that chain that forms the purposeful. It forms the connected. It forms that structure by which we can make sense of the world and of reality. We can ask ourselves, well, what are the other links in that chain? Well, the other links in that chain, if he is to say that he himself is one link in that chain, we could say that his will or his soul is one link. Another would be, it could be another person, it doesn't really matter. It could be a person in which they see something in, they see a pattern in. It could be experiences, it could be anything that connects that chain up to the source. We can also think of this in terms of a river. Now, a large river has many different tributaries, many different branches, like branches of a tree. In this way, we can understand, especially in the case of a tree, that if a branch is disconnected from the tree, it is not the tree. We can see that there are necessary connections made from the trunk to the periphery, such that the periphery is able to receive nutrients, whatever, or water from the main river, nutrients from the roots of the tree, so that it can continue to exist as it is. It can remain within its integrity. So remaining within one's integrity means to remain in place in that chain such that they are being nourished by the divine source. If they are a tributary of the river, they are being nourished by the water that flows through it. If they are a tree, they are being nourished again by water and by nutrients from the soil to the periphery to that branch. That branch is something that perhaps we would represent, or a small tributary of a river is the human place. Now I should probably add, since I was discussing to walk within, or to walk in, means that he is necessarily taking part in the whole. He is not, if he was walking outside of his integrity, he would be considered separate from those principles by which he would be able to intuit that which is good. He would be walking outside of that chain, and so it's sort of an irony or an interesting, almost oxymoron, in which if he is walking outside of his integrity, he is walking completely inside of himself. But that would be, again, outside of his integrity. And from this vantage point, interestingly going in the reverse of the flow of the verse, what is just becomes more clear. Because in the first instance, when we say the just man, and before even considering walking within one's integrity, we are forced to reckon with what a just man is. But when we consider a person that walks in his integrity, we've sort of come to what a just man looks like. A just man is somebody that is effective, decisive, honest, humble in their decision-making, such that, I think, of the illustration that we've represented with the chain, he's able to understand that he has a place in that chain. And his strategy, his approach to life, is to determine how he is more able to sufficiently fulfill his role as one of those links in the chain. And by doing so, a just man spreads that truthfulness and that light out to the unintelligible. He is a man that can raise the material. Now, there are plenty of men that I think exhibit just behaviors. Interestingly, I was watching the movie Scarface not too long ago, and that's an interesting movie full of contradictions. A man, Tony, that has such a drive and has such a spirit. Much of it is bound up in wickedness and self-centeredness. Ultimately, his wickedness is his undoing. But he demonstrates qualities of a just man. He has strong principles. He is committed to what he believes, even though what he believes may be weakening his foundation. But he also has moral principles that are true, like not murdering women or children based on the grounds of their purity. He also has a strong love for his family, for his mother and his sister. Again, his behavior is taken to an extreme and ends up losing them relationally. And he is a good example of somebody that cannot be considered a just man, even though he has just qualities. And he is somebody that fails to walk in his integrity. He, as a link in the chain, fails. And his life ends because of his profound confusion and lack of understanding. Okay, so this is the first half of the verse. A just man walks in his integrity. His children are blessed after him. Now, it doesn't we don't need too much to add here. The primary work is within the walk within the integrity, but his children are blessed after him. They are blessed because they are the products of continuity. They are the products of integration. And such, if we can imagine an integrated whole, that of a part of something that receives from that source, such that they are nourished, again, like the tributary of a river or of a branch of a tree, we can appreciate that after a just man's life, or as a just man brings into the world children, they then become the next link in the chain, ever forming and establishing their own relationship to that broader whole. But they are necessarily nourished by virtue of they being his offspring. A king that sits in the throne of judgment scatters away all evil with his eyes. Okay, so there are some good symbols here. We have throne of judgment. We have the king. We have evil, the scattering of evil. We have this behavior and this action that is precipitated by his gaze, by his eyes. So what can we understand in the first instance of the throne of judgment? Let's begin with the word throne. So, the root, or I should say the Greek word that is derived from the Proto-Indo-European root dher, which signifies to support or to hold up. Now the Greek word that throne is derived from is thronos, which means seat or chair. So now what's interesting is the continuity, the etymological continuity, in relation to the discussion that I was just having about the integrity. And the examination of language, such it has emerged and it has been brought down to us, surely is much like that of the tributary of a river. And what we drink from is the light of those words that were put into being, that were set into motion because of some expansion of thought by some experience or philosophy or observation or otherwise. It's quite an interesting reflection. So insofar as we understand the throne to be related, at least in part, to a seat, a type of chair, a magnificent chair, perhaps we can say a metaphorical chair, a chair that is meant to represent sovereign power. Now, if we think of a seat, I want to say in the literal sense, but the modern connotation for literal tends to have this colloquial distinction of base and of lack of color, brutalish view of objects and of people. And this is not necessarily where I would like to be. This is not what I would like to mean when I use the word literal. But I think that there is a utility in starting from the minimal, from that brutal aspect. And from what we might consider to be these days literal, move to a type of literal that is more representative of both the material object, but also the symbol that transcends the material beneath, or the material that makes up the chair or the throne, the divine chair, I guess. Or not divine chair, but in the case of man, the kingly throne is this distinction of power. So this seat, what can be said of it? What can be said of a human being that finds himself seated in a chair? A person at rest, a person engaged in non-physical manners. And it's difficult exactly how to draw base distinctions such as these, because certainly we can make connections between a man seated, not engaged in physical pleasures or physical pursuits, which may mean his role in society is more administrative, which would be representative of a kingly position. Of course, there are inconsistencies with that, because many kings of old have fought in wars. In the case of Sparta in particular, the two kings that were brought together by the council and the representatives of the various clans of people their role in society was to lead out the army, and really nothing more. And so, even here there is a difficulty trying to wrap around exactly where to place the king in relation to the base as we move up in that trajectory, that symbolic trajectory. Now, we'll leave that aside for the moment, because that probably doesn't make any sense. I think it quickly becomes apparent that the simple matters, the base in terms of simple rather than foundational, are insufficient. They are at a level that is insufficient to approach the usage of the word throne in this verse. But I think what should be discussed here lies within the realm that has been discussed, within the relational. And among the relational, I think we can recognize the positional. And as I've recognized the position of a king, or the position of somebody that is seated affairs tend to be of a particular type, especially in the old world, administrative affairs. There were not many such positions. I think positions that are afforded such things can be either seen as prestigious or, in the old sense of the word, womanly, sort of a derogatory. But in the case of the sovereign, in the case of the highest administrator in the land, we are talking about a special relationship, and we are talking about a particular position. So the natural question is, well, what relationship are we talking about? And what position are we considering? How is the position of the king relative to other things that we can identify? In the first instance, in the case of the relational, the supreme administrator in human affairs, but also in heavenly affairs. But to begin with human affairs, I think naturally deals with heavenly decrees due to the sweeping authority that the king has. It's funny, throughout the ages and all of the different situations in which kings have come to power, and all of the individuals that lie directly beneath them, some good counselors, some bad counselors, sometimes the king representing a position, a purely symbolic position, in the sense that, or perhaps I should say not symbolic, but rather, well, it is symbolic, but it's a symbol in such a way, it's an empty symbol. There are periods in history in which the kingship represented an empty symbol, a symbol of perhaps solidarity, of unity, and yet beneath, in the chambers, in the halls, there is counselors bickering and fighting one another for power. There are clans that are fighting one another, among one another. There have been periods throughout history where there have been strong centralized authority, in which the symbol of the monarch, the king, truly held the power worthy of being that symbol, of being the representation of power, of having that unified force, having the ability to decree and act as a judge upon the rest in society. And so I think herein lies a potential path for which we can discuss this relationality. Because within the king's authority also lies responsibility. And responsibility is one of the things that I have talked about already. In this chapter. Particularly in verse 4, the sluggard will not plow by reason of the cold, therefore shall he beg in harvest, and have nothing. There is responsibility buried within that verse, and what to do with it, what it is. And it comes up again here. A king that sits in the throne of judgment scatters away all evil with his eyes. And so to understand the position of the king and the symbol of the throne, I think one must understand the responsibility of the king, and thereby the extension, the relationships that form because of that responsibility. So briefly, I'd like to mention the etymological chain that is related to the word responsibility. Now, I won't talk of specific words in the old sense, but from the Proto-Indo-European we have this beginning, that is the conception to call or to speak, and it continues to evolve from there to call or to speak, to say, then it moves to answer or to respond, then responded or answered, and from there, the word continues, and we see the meaning being answerable or being accountable. Again, the acceptance of responsibility, the acceptance of some burden, sacrifice comes into mind here, of obligation. A king that sitteth in the throne room of judgment scattereth away all evil with his eyes. Of this king, and of the position that he holds, he is certainly somebody that is vested with a large amount of power, and this power allows him, it affords him opportunities. Now, the opportunities that are in front of him depend on what he values. It depends on where his attention is. It depends how he sees the world. And going from the sense of responsibility, I think we don't necessarily have to be talking about a just individual. We don't have to be talking about a righteous king. We don't have to be talking about King David. We could take any number of kings of old Israel that were not particularly well suited for their position, that took for granted the opportunities that were brought to them, that gave in to their base desires, that satisfied sexual pleasures, and in vain neglected their administrative duties. So in consideration of a situation in which we do not particularly consider his goodness or his badness, what can we say of his responsibility? Certainly, if we talk about goodness or badness, we can understand how his relationship might change. Now, that would be an interesting avenue to walk down. Why would it be the case that a king's relationship to his subjects, to his counselors, to his own family, why would this change because of his beliefs, because of his principles, Well, if we examine the evolution of the word responsibility, it is something. The evolution itself is a relationship, in the sense that it moves from the internal to the external. It is an exercise in the expression of thought, that is to say, to call, to speak. And as the word evolves, what becomes is the reception of information. It is the answer to the speak. It is an answer to the call. Now, from being answered comes this seemingly revelatory enhancement of the word, which is being answerable, being accountable. I want to hear use again the word responsible. But being accountable is being exposed to the response to the call, the initial call. And responsibility says nothing of what ought to do in response to the answer that they receive from a call. At least in this sense, in the sense of the Middle English period, the 1150 to 1500. Again, the definitions being answerable and being accountable. It is not until the sort of the modern era, in which the term is broadened yet again, or extended yet again, such as a story. And what is revealed is the concept of duty or obligation. What emerges is the ought from the expression, the reception, sort of a contemplative period, that of understanding the thinking about the answer, being answerable, being accountable, and then to the ought, to the formulation of some truth. All of this lies within the package of responsibility. Responsibility is inherent to any given position in society. This is why it's relevant to the verse. And given that the throne is a symbol of kingly position, of power, of sovereignty, of agency, the king himself occupies this position. So if we are to take the integrity of responsibility, that is its continuity, and we are to recognize, but perhaps in a subtle way, understand that where responsibility as a word, as something that we can use to understand, it is no longer in its infancy. It comes to us in its modern form, its contemporary form, in the form that I have described. But we also, I think, must understand that without its original form, without its more adolescent forms, which were necessary, and by respect to that necessity, should not be diminished, I think it is reasonable to ask the question of the king, to whom does he call? For what reason does he speak? And by this, and through this, as we follow the chain, I think we can begin to understand the king's responsibility. So this is where we must start. So this marks the passage of a new day. Now, not every time that a new day rolls over, and there are bound to be 3 or 4 within every episode, do I make it known that a new day has passed, but in instances where I think there is going to be a significant breach in continuity between the prior interpretation and the new, I think it's worthwhile to mention that today is a new day. And there may be a period of coming back up to speed in order to understand my previous line of reasoning. So please excuse any repeat thoughts here. But from what I reviewed just now, I finished talking about the throne. Or at least I finished talking about responsibility as its evolution throughout the ages. And this has led us up to speaking about the king and the throne. Now what I left off with was a question. To whom does the king call? And for what reason does he speak? On the surface, perhaps this may seem like a trivial matter, a simple matter. But I think that with consideration of trivial matters, at least those that seem to be so, there is often much deception, and that what lies beneath the surface is much greater than that which is seen at the outset. Now this is where the concerns of starting over anew, or beginning at a new day, comes into conflict. Because in order for me to understand to whom the king calls to, or the reason that he speaks, I must reimagine the landscape that was before me the other day. And it can be difficult at the first instance to determine exactly where I am in this dimension, in this space. So I've mentioned the danger of superficiality. So we have that recognition, but we must penetrate deeper into this. So from the other day, I like to recall the positionality that the king represents. And I had a thought just now of how this thought experiment can be applied just as easily to the individual as it can to the king. We can ask of the individual, to whom does he call, or to whom do I call? For what reason do I speak? And I think what we may find are similar answers, similar responsibilities, at least in terms of the ought. But we're not too concerned at this moment with the ought. We're concerned about what exactly his callings, what his speech, what the effects of that is. And given his position in the hierarchy, given the responsibility that he holds to himself and to his subjects, the gravity and the impact has much greater sway within this individual. And so it creates for us sort of a more interesting philosophical exploration. So let's start at the beginning. Let's start at the place of Genesis. I think we have two possible trajectories. I think they eventually converge on one another, so it doesn't matter all that much which road we take at the beginning. I think the first, in terms of the intelligibility of mind, and that of the kingly position. And here I think we can consider matters, let's say, of the king, or the king to be. We can consider his life before the position of kingship, and also his life as a king. Now in both situations, he has responsibility, just as we all do. At the outset, he may hear a call to which he must formulate an answer and respond, and in such an instance, he, by the nature of external input, responds. Or, at the beginning, he formulates a call. Now the question is this entirely different? Can we say at the initial that there is a formulation of a call and that there is nothing that precedes it? Now, in the first instance, I mentioned some external input that prompts one to respond. Now, I suppose we can make a difference between that and a situation in which a man finds himself within his mind. And here, for whatever reason, I think of the analogy in physics of that of friction, and that the coefficient of friction is almost never zero unless it's sort of in outer space. And I have to imagine that just as the coefficient of friction, this value for which we attribute some resistance to an object as it moves through space, or on Earth, not necessarily outer space, but on Earth. An example of friction, we think of the tires on a road, perhaps, which has a lot of different dimensions to it that we can analyze, that of the weight of the vehicle, the type of the tire, the surface that they're driving on, etc. But as this friction exists in the material world, this coefficient of friction exists in the material world, I wonder about that coefficient of the friction of thought, perhaps. Now, friction here, I have to wonder if this is exactly the word that I want to use for what I mean. And here, I think, is a useful place to contemplate, because it's such a bizarre thing to have the sense of understanding and knowing what to say, and yet not having the words to say it. It raises interesting questions of what, if language is not the foremost formulator of meaning within my mind, then what is it? And perhaps that's not the right way to go about thinking about it. Because language, I think, is an element of that user interface. Another element is that of the heart, which I've discussed quite a bit. Perhaps we can say another element is culture, which maybe language would be a part of. It's kind of hard to say, but the point here is that I think there are multiple elements that go into formulating understanding. An expression, the ability to articulate, perhaps not only to oneself but also to somebody else, such that somebody else and the internal self is satisfied with some internal continuity or consistency, is the point at which, depending on the context, something is either received or something is responded to, or something is called or formulated or spoken. Now, of this path concerning the initial verbiage, the initial spoken language, Imagine in the king, or in his infancy, or in anyone's infancy, considering a thought that is articulated, whether by language or otherwise. What is the reason that he does so? One can say that there are many potential reasons. The reasons may, to a degree, depend on his desire, may depend on the heart, may depend on his needs. But these don't quite satisfy. The heart perhaps satisfies a little bit more than the needs. The needs are quite related to that of the desires of the heart. In certain instances in which luxury is not a gift, I think that the needs of man definitely dictate more of his implicit, perhaps unconscious behavior, for he is driven by the necessity for survival. And that sort of thing, if we consider that level to be a call, I suppose we can examine that before we examine more sophisticated elements of what we might consider to be a call. But what of this call to survival? Why do we do it? Is the call purely internal? Is it selfish? Is it because of the heart and the mind that desires something? What is the desire for existence? One can say that the desire for existence may be undergirded by many different potential reasons. Again, that of the satisfaction of certain desires, the manipulation of the pleasure center, for which some people may revolve their life and meaning around, just to purely be satisfied, and that is enough for them to justify their existence. I think there are many others that are not tormented by such superficiality, in which the need or the desire for existence extends beyond that of the superficial. Again, as I've talked about before, this implicitness of survival in the human being and in animals is a curious thing. And the question that arises here, of course, is somebody that is satisfied on a material level. If I was in a state of destitution, would my mind be as plagued with matters of existence as it is now? Of course it would be to some degree, but would I explore and express in the same way? Well, certainly my mind may not have enough stamina to be able to represent the world in the way I do now, or to discuss it in the way that I do now. Or perhaps it would. One has to wonder. Gandhi comes to mind here, somebody that willfully starved himself for certain ends beyond himself, bringing himself close to death. And yet, if he wanted to, he could have ended that fast, that necessary state of starvation. But because of his will and his desire to change something about the society that he found himself in, he was willing to make a certain sacrifice that communicated something more than perhaps his words did at that moment. Of course, he had accumulated a massive mutual understanding among his followers. People understood what he was doing and what he was about. And his action, of course, because of that following and of that relationship, of that relationality, of many different relationships, he was able to build an architecture, a framework, an infrastructure by which his communication could extend beyond the linguistic and be behavioral, because he had the attention of others. So I'll place that point aside for now. I think it's important to keep in the back of the mind. My apologies for my deliberation, but I think it's necessary. What strikes me when I watch a painter paint, there are many little steps that one doesn't consider, like the subtlety of the backdrop on a canvas. And it's not just one color. Many times there are multiple colors that are layered on the canvas to create a certain backdrop. And within that multiple layers, on top of those layers are more and more layers that emerge out of the backing color. And the experience is kind of it's transcendent in a way, because it is illuminating something that wasn't illuminated before, because otherwise the canvas was blank, void of that meaning. Now, such is the pursuit of mind, I think. Now, enough of that. To get back to what I was saying at the outset, where does this call come from? So we've discussed necessity for survival, and we've discussed the Gandhian example of willful sacrifice, such that it extends beyond that of the destitute. Okay. So at some level it is satisfying to understand that even in dire straits, although it may be difficult to appreciate, and perhaps in many instances it may not even show itself, the type of spirit and commitment, faithful commitment, to one's call, to something that they've heard within themselves or from without, such that they are able to justify their existence. Now, something else comes into mind here, which I touched on briefly, which was the expression that sometimes it doesn't present itself. Now, what does that mean? By it, I mean the willful attachment to some reason for existing. And I think when the will is lost, when the spirit suffers such an insult, that when the spirit ceases to become or to be this thing of emanation from that of the seat of being of a person, that of his soul, but rather it becomes a leaking thing, just like air leaks from a tire, or as a valve is unable to maintain the pressure, or a pipe is unable to maintain pressure within it, such that it has consequences downstream. In such a situation, we think of pathology, rather than that of something that is admirable or strength-oriented, that of a healthy spirit. Again, when I say emanatory, I think of smoke from a fire, something that signifies to the person that there is some process at play, even if they can't understand or see exactly where it's coming from. And in the case of the pathological, it is not the smoke of the fire that we are concerned about here. It is not the burning of something that ought to be burning brightly and strongly. It is something that is losing. It is something that is becoming darker instead of emitting something that is brighter and lighter. And in this way, sort of a roundabout way to arrive at what I want to say, but there was a conversation that I was listening to some time ago in which two people were discussing history, that of the Holocaust, and just general history, and about a historian's view of humanity during times of struggle and strife, and whether his opinion of the entirety of everything that he understands from history is a sort of reflection on human nature. When the going gets rough, is there something I can't recall exactly, but to paraphrase, it is there something within the human being that is beautiful upon the doorstep of the finality, the ending, the suffering? Is there something that the human being recognizes within his suffering that is beautiful, or that can be beautiful? And his response was no. People generally, when they find themselves in such a state, they are reduced. They are much reduced. Whether it be to a state of barbarism or a state of abandonment of all that was held before. It was quite a pessimistic view of human nature. And perhaps he wouldn't necessarily agree full-heartedly that in cases of suffering, humanity cannot express some beautiful things, but I think generally speaking, there was this pessimism. And to that point, even if it is true that if most of us in a condition of starvation, if we can imagine ourselves in the position of the Jews in the Holocaust, being deprived of so much of everything that they had known, and the mind being so corrupted by that exhaustion and that lack of sustenance, and the constant drone and desire for needing that sustenance, that it becomes this overlord, this all-consuming thing, the deity of necessity, the deity of survival. Although I think that this is something that is reasonable for most people to find themselves again in this state of subjection. Even in cases of material abundance, people can find themselves in states of subjection. They can find a tyranny where there ought not to be any. Certainly, I think a tyranny is easier to overcome a mind when the mind is deprived of certain fundamental resources. It's hard to argue or to complain about an engine that doesn't run if there's no gasoline in it. But to the degree that there is still any gasoline left for some reaction to occur, the possibility, at the very least, exists for the mind to appreciate existence. But not just appreciate existence, to take the time to hear the call. But therein lies the question again. What is the call? What is the reason? In some sense, I'm asking what the reason for existence is. So where are we? Well, so far I've come to some understanding that the call can be beyond language, though it can include language. Language is a tool. The call can exist, but although much depreciated in cases of extreme necessity, the possibility exists that the call can be heard and can be acted upon. The call can be external, in which somebody hears it, that it is not something that is stirred within the heart, or something that is seemingly flipped on within the mind, like a switch. Now, a call can be from the outside. It can be explicit, it could be linguistic, it could be behavioral from another person, or something that's a little bit more integrated, in which it could be a subtle thing from the external environment. It could be some observation that by itself doesn't really mean much, but in the context of a particular line of reasoning, it is the missing link to fit a chain together, a causal chain such that, or perhaps not a causal chain, but a chain of relationality, such that a continuity is formed. And as a result of that continuity, we have an intact line, sort of like a telephone line, for which information travels. And if that information travels over that bridge, then the call is heard. So it's relational. It's hard to get away from this relational thing. And now I struggle a little bit, I think, to really reckon with an absolute internal calling. Now, I suppose that it is possible, but it seems that without the world, without all that input, it would be very difficult. Of course, I think without a lot of external input, and perhaps even in cases of solitary confinement, for example, there's a lot of good work that could be done just sitting and reflecting. That is sort of preparing the space to be ready to receive a call. And it might just be something, and then all of a sudden, it's easy to recognize. And so that aspect is down the road of piety and practice. That is the preparation of soil to plant the seed in. So as far as this dilemma is concerned about the absoluteness of a call coming from within the conscious mind of man, I'm not sure I can give a definitive statement on it, or a definitive reflection, but it really doesn't matter in terms of our exploration into the king that sits on the throne of judgment. What we come back to, though, is the call itself. And I think the call is what I just have described. It is that continuity, that relational continuity, such that some thought can be formulated in some reasonable way. Now, this is very vague. It is not all that satisfying. What exactly do I mean about this continuity, or this relationality? I think fundamentally, if we're not going to get lost in the weeds, or like a chain that has multiple different links, we ought not to get caught up in different links of the whole that attaches something together. What we are being attached to, I think, is purposefulness and directedness. What we are being drawn away from is detachment, blindness, darkness, confusion. Now, within this sphere, the human mind is open to all sorts of different things that are false. We are fallen beings. We are sort of at war with God, if you want, such that the mind, given its independence, can form as it sees fit any sort of relationality and continuity. And to the degree that it is mistaken, the mind will find itself in disagreement, or in a state of disharmony, disunity, such that conflict will arise. conflict as a result of misunderstanding, conflict as a result of purposelessness or misplaced attention, the failure to recognize one's purpose, the failure to recognize meaning. A king that sits at the throne of judgment scatters away all evil with his eyes. Now, so with all of that, the king, the call that he hears is an interesting one. Now, keeping in mind the environment that we are approaching this, what we've just come from. Consider the chain of relationality. Consider the fallen nature of man. Consider the position in terms of the hierarchy of delegation, administrative power that the king represents and holds. Think of the various inputs that he receives from all of his subjects. Think of the ways in which the inputs of all of his subjects can come together and coalesce into something that he can identify. Consider this call, and consider the individual, exactly what it means for the individual to find a calling of their own. And through them, up to him, and through him, out to them, we have this strange cycle. This strange hierarchy and structure of mind and of human direction. So insofar as the king is concerned, and that of a society in which a king is present, more of a highly centralized society, I think we can appreciate if we map this system, sort of political system, over that chain of relationality. I think what we can appreciate at the minimum is that the king has no insignificant role in developing that relationality, because to a large degree the king directs not just administrative affairs, but also theological and political affairs of the population. And of course the king is propped up by the populace and also various counselors that advise him and educate him. So there's some interplay there. And of the more prudent kings, I think you get more of this listening to counsel, more of the acceptance of the concern of the populace and this sort of thing. Again, in certain societies, certain kings had less of a role in the direction, in the fundamental direction of the culture and of that society, of their societies, but in other more tyrannical cases, the king is the utmost and has quite an authority. Now, regardless of the situation, we can appreciate the different levels. And it's kind of hard, because at one instance, I would like to reflect on the self and how it's related to that, but also my mind goes through very quickly a vast array of different positions that are in society that communicate and that build upon one another in terms of the administrative or the power sense. Is kind of hard to understand exactly where the chain of relationality is most impacted. But not getting lost in that, certainly the king has quite a substantial impact on this relationality, the chain of relationality. So exactly what does that mean, this chain of relationality? Well, again, if we imagine responsibility is accountability. It in the first instance, my laborious effort to describe the initial circumstance in which a person hears some call, from wherever it comes from, whatever it might be, that call orients him and it puts him in relationship to something else, whether of necessity or of some higher understanding, and all probabilities aside. So he has this call, and then he himself perhaps can make a call, he can say something in response. Okay, so this is the first part of this responsibility, is to make that response to the call. Now his response, to a degree, I think can either be followed up by something, or it could be his decision to accept, without perhaps understanding exactly what it is that, if what he says is actually that which is. And so in the case of responsibility, it is accepting accountability. It is accepting after one has made a decision, has made a judgment. What they are taking into account is their rightness or wrongness, and to the degree that they are accountable is the degree to which they are willing to admit and to analyze that which what they have done or what they have said is right or wrong, and the reasoning for that. Now this rightness and wrongness, this revolves around an axis, surely, and to a degree our accountability is, by extension, another degree to which we understand and recognize the axis around which we revolve. There are plenty of abnormal and pathological situations for which a person, an animal, a mechanical thing, a machine, can be disoriented such that the axis that it ought to be rotating around is off, and it could damage the machine, it could damage the biological structure, or whatever. And in the case of the king, the chain to which we are bound to that centerpiece, to the rightness. The king that sits on the throne of judgment is fundamentally an individual that holds a particular position of power that has a particular, that has a large impact on the way in which we are oriented about an axis. Judgment, of course, being something for which we consider at the fundamental level. Now, again, this is putting aside probabilities, this is putting aside necessity, this is pure devotion to consideration, that of judgment. Now, it seems apparent here that what we are dealing with in this verse is a righteous king. The king that sitteth in the throne of judgment scatters away all evil with his eyes. Evil is something that sits at the edge of intelligibility. It is that which tempts it to it. It is the thing that exists at the edge of existence. And its primary purpose, the axis that it revolves around, is the extreme fringe. And evil is foolish in the sense that it wishes for non-existence, or it wishes for subjection, I suppose. It wishes for inconsistency. For selfish desire. But here we move away, I think, a little bit from evil. We consider wickedness. And evil, I want to maintain something at the fringe, but it's not just at the fringe, because there are plenty of things at the fringe that aren't evil. The evil is fundamentally looking away from the axis. Even though they may be bound by a chain to that axis, they wish and they desire to be in the darkness, which of course they can't be. That is their fundamental flaw. And the thing that gives them sustenance is actually the light, for which people actually desire to be closer. They use that light and that axiomatic understanding of rightness and wrongness in order to fuel their own desperate attempts to destroy it. It's a strange, counterintuitive antagonism. So this king, upon his throne of judgment, is yes or no, true or false. The scattering away of evil with his eyes is an interesting expression. For to scatter something, I think of perhaps a flock of birds, or a herd of deer together that are spooked and they scatter. But perhaps this is not necessarily entirely consistent with the word scatter, because they may move away from some impetus or some stimuli, but they often remain together. So it's like a flock. Scatter seems to imply some dispersion, in which the continuity that whole, that flock had once had, is now separated. It is broken up. And I think there's a lot of utility that can be said of evil that is broken up, that is less concentrated. For evil that is more concentrated at the heart of a person or heart of a society is much more difficult to separate. It's like that of a large tumor. And I think of two different situations in which, of the tumor example, you can have one that's sort of like a mass in one place, but also more of a systemic cancer in which there's multiple different tumors. It's hard to scatter such a thing from the whole that we consider the body. So, nonetheless, there are many different, I think, potentials for which one can find themselves in trouble, for which the scattering of something may depend, the ease by which something is scattered may depend. But to return to the verse, scattering away all evil with his eyes. And it's a strange thing to use the symbol of eyes. The eyes are an organ of sight, of visual perception. Of course, the mind is the thing that perceives. The eyes are the thing that take in a certain type of information. They respond to a certain type of information, the visible wavelengths of light on the electromagnetic spectrum. And the degree to which this organ is able to pick up on some aspect of reality, in order for that mechanism, that mind, to intuit and to make intelligible. I think from this, we consider another relationship. That is a relationship to the part of that world that we all share, most of us share vision. And because of that, we reliably are able to act in the world. but it's more than just reliability in acting. I think fundamentally it is that relationship. It is the relationship to something, and in particular, if we are to consider all the possibilities of consciousness and conscious beings, man is the one that exists within this world, within this physical world. And because he is such a way, and because he has this consciousness of being, for whatever reason, this is the situation. This is the reality that he finds himself in. Now, it is a particular conclusion that one comes to, whether or not his experience is unique and there are no others like it, or that he is in a sea of like experiences for which there is an intelligible whole to that experience, a directed intelligible whole to that experience. A king that sits in the throne of judgment scatters away all evil with his eyes. So I said that the bit about the human being in its particular context is because it's important to understand that if we're going to have a broader view of consciousness, that outside of man, if we are to consider the king and to consider the symbols that are used here, the throne, judgment, scattering away of evil with the eyes, we have to recognize that this verse is specific to our condition, and the eyes are the organ by which the mind is able to bring the heavenly down to the restricted, down to the finite, down to the fallen, and to that of man. His eyes, although establish a relationship to the physical world, which allows him to see and appreciate the environment for which his conscious mind can take hold, it can grip reality. It is also a conduit for which he can see the aspects of his reality for which those divine sources of that evil can take place. And of course, this evil exists almost paradoxically within the experience of his mind in the lonesome atmosphere of the conscious world. Man finds himself struggling with this, with the heavenly call. And he struggles because of his finitude, because of his fallenness. But insofar as the king sits on the throne of judgment to scatter away evil with his eyes, what he sees is that element, that heavenly element for which conscious beings hold and carry the capacity to decouple themselves from the axis of life, the bounds and the restrictions that they are born into, all sorts of different things, all different manifestations for which evil can find itself into our hearts and into our understanding. Perhaps some are explicit, some are more deceptive, for which we are unable to recognize the consequences of our beliefs. and the degree to which a righteous king that sits upon that throne of judgment, the degree to which he scatters away the evil is the degree to which he identifies it, makes it known to himself and to perhaps the army or to the populace, is that degree to which he is able to uproot it and to disperse it such that it does not have any type of pull or pathological effect on his country, his society. Because that evil would destroy not only him, but also everything, the whole point of the enterprise. And in the face of absolute purposelessness, I think the alternative to accept a proper judgment is quite high, or it is quite desirable. It is a degree of necessity, it is a heavenly necessity rather than a material or physical necessity. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? One of the things that I place high value in is this practice. And it's not just this practice, but it has been the general practice over the past 3 years or so of coming to and taking a different approach to education, primarily through philosophical and historical means. But this approach has brought me a newfound color and vibrancy to life. There are, from the depths of my melancholy, for which I believe that I am prone to for whatever reason, I find this healing spirit that comes over me when I engage in this type of practice, or in general reading something of a certain threshold of sophistication and of content that addresses, that takes that melancholy. It looks at it on its face, and perhaps it doesn't necessarily dissolves it, but it soothes it. It smooths the rough edges. It gives it context. It illuminates the surrounding area for which it could be worked on. Now, true melancholy, I think, is something that requires this work. It is like chiseling a fine sculpture out of marble. It takes quite some time. It takes imagination. It takes discipline. It takes humility. But over time, the melancholy, that rough exterior surface, is now turned, or becomes morphed into something that is beautiful. The original sentiment, perhaps, that was there, the feelings that were left over by that melancholy, perhaps they don't go away, but they are reorganized, recontextualized, such that now the feeling is not sadness. It is not a pulling away. It is a type of presence. It is an adequate hole for which that melancholy attempted to fill. Or I should say, it's an adequate plug for the hole that the melancholy attempted to fill. Now, I say all of this because no matter how committed and faithful we are, past experiences of doubt, and of unstable faith allows us to really appreciate the state of mind for which a person can find themselves in that truly is a hopeless condition, that is oriented in a way that is not the way that a human being ought to be oriented, that is oriented in a downward direction, perhaps, instead of that of upward. They remain at the base of the mountain instead of ascending. And within that memory, I think, lies an understanding, but also some peace. This is something that has, and that will never really truly go away. And I think this is true not just of a person that has experienced melancholy, but a person that has, just a person that exists in general, I think is prone, or at least the likelihood, or the probability exists, that some hole will open within them that may cause them to doubt and to lose their footing. And I think if one does not experience this abjectly, what we find, I think, in our everyday experience are moments of moral failure, are moments of inattentiveness. And this is not particular to that of the introverted or the melancholic. As I feel that I have made some progress in my spiritual life and my connectedness to the higher power, I at the same time am more aware of the situations that I find myself in, for which I revert perhaps back to an older state of behavior, one that I had spent a long time, a state of being that I had spent a long time embodying. And it is difficult. It is one thing to find myself in my room, in a place of comfort, in which I can easily put my mind in a place of contemplation without all of the external distractions and all of the subtlety that comes from human interaction. Even in the professional context, for which I often communicate with individuals, my profession is very interpersonal. But the professional boundaries are such that, I think, establishes unspoken guardrails for which I, somebody that finds themselves in a place of authority, in many cases, has the luxury to guide in such a way, perhaps to rely to a certain degree on these guardrails, almost like bumpers in bowling, to guide the individual, the mind, and the perception of another in the direction that I wish and desire it for it to go. Now, there is a relational component in this occupation, no doubt. But in matters of personal affairs, I find that these guardrails are weak. And I think they are weak because of the relative short amount of time that I've found myself in a secure relationship with the divine. That there has yet been sufficient time and experience to change my relationships, my close relationships, such that there is this mutual understanding. Now, I know that this is vague, but I think there's a more important point that needs to be addressed here. That among my close interactions, and it's not all of my close interpersonal relationships, but of some quite important ones, I think that I often revert back to this inattentive state, almost by habit. And I think, even though it doesn't happen in every instance, and that there has been some net improvement in terms of my connection in a spiritual sense to those to whom I love, the risk of flippant, what should I say, the heart as a flippant driver, perhaps, of the vehicle. That is, being within an environment that can often be emotionally charged, in an environment among friends that typically lacks a level of discernment that I have come to know and love and appreciate and find a connection with. This sort of thing, as it stands, I think is something that weighs on my heart. It is something that tempts my heart into a place that I wish it to be liberated from. Who can say, I have made my heart clean? I am pure from my sin. Now when I read that verse, I think exactly this situation, and this personal situation in my life, for which, again, I found myself at a crossroads. And the crossroads, I think, the road that I am crossing, there is this intersection between what is, what will be, and what was. Now, the what was, in some sense, continues, embodied within my personal relations that had not undergone a similar transformation such that I had, sort of on an individual level. Now, there are a few relationships that have developed with me along this trajectory, but to my shame, I have been unable to take everybody along with me in such a way that they are able to see the change that is occurring, not necessarily that I wish to impose something upon them, such that they are now in this vehicle, on this spiritual journey with me. That is not the case. What I would like is mutual sight. At the very least, to be seen exactly where I am walking. And in these relationships, the direction that I'm walking and the vision that those of whom that I love have, they will not be dissuaded by what has been going on within me. And I know this because of love. Now, there is a thread here that I'm slowly but surely tying to this verse. Who can say, I have made my heart clean, I am pure from my sin? Who can say If those who love me cannot say, if they cannot see it, surely there is something within me that has failed. A failure in the sense that something has not been shown. But I have to wonder. I may be entering into a more personal interpretation here of this verse. Now, sometimes this happens, but this is a unique situation, I think. For this situation in this crossroads, I think is something that needs to be resolved. And there's something that I need to say as a matter of correction. I think that my relationships, my personal relationships, among them there are a few that have certainly evolved quite a bit. I think all of them have evolved, despite my previous exhortation, explaining that I wish for them to come along or to see. I think that there has been much seeing done, but in regard to the relationship or the degree to which some have seen it versus others, I think there are those who lie in a particular camp of having not experienced a sense of grace from me that they deserve. A sense of grace and love that they deserve. And it is not the case that I am to show them some light in some way. It's light in the sense of love, light in the sense of grace. But my behavior is such that I fall into silence among the chaotic ramblings of a secular family and of men and women perhaps that are deeply entrenched within two opposing views, that of a material and that of a strong familial, all of which that is not grounded around much of anything. Of course, the family is a strong thing, but the general hearth around which these connections that are made both between individuals and also above existing structures such as the family, and the family thereby oriented to something outside of it, that doesn't exist. And that is difficult for me to bridge that gap. Not that I, again, am trying to take anybody with, or impose perhaps, in that sense. But rather, my goal, and to my shame, my failure, has been not showing enough of this understanding and of appreciation and of grace. And in such situations, I certainly find myself asking a variation of, who can say, I have made my heart clean. I am pure from my sin, ? I feel as though if I had truly made my heart clean, I would not be subject to this antagonism. I would not fall prey to the more tyrannical aspects of familial discord. Now, who can say, of course, there is only that which is true that can truly say, if my heart is clean. But in issues of transcendence, in issues of attentiveness, I think that in order to impart a degree of purity, greater attention needs to be a part of this equation. Attention to discretion and resolution of conflict. But it's more than that, it's also directional. It is to move away from that horizontal. It is to move away from that perpendicular of the crossroad and to move forward. For the goal has been, for the past number of years, to move forward and not to take that right-hand turn or the left-hand turn. But surely it is the case that there is danger with self-assessment, that one can believe that they have transcended some previous state and yet can find themselves in a further state of delusion, more of an entrapped state of being. And perhaps it's a simple matter to interpret this verse. In the first instance, who can say, attributing that who to God, and while that might be true, and while it might do us well to pay attention to all of the details of life for which we might hear the divine call, I think there is perhaps little better place to look than within the minds and the hearts of those that love us most. And if they can say that there has been a change in our heart, a change towards cleanliness perhaps, towards a place of purity, then I think we find ourselves in a position for which we can say that we have improved, at least that we have changed. Certainly there can be problems there as well. We can receive false information. There is additional benefit from positive interactions with others that we barely know, for which we establish strong relationships with them. We avoid the antagonism. We provide for them a sense of orientation to the good, such that their expression, the filter through which their desires and emotions run, is made more effective by having interacted with us. And by extension, facilitating such an environment of reciprocity, I think we too benefit from that. That relationality is this sort of slowly building thing. Again, it is a reciprocal thing. It is the reciprocation of goodness, the building of goodness. Divers weights and divers measures, both of them are like abominations to the Lord. So as with many verses, it's appropriate to discuss the primary words, not only their meaning but also their origin. So of the word divers, this is a word that I think we have encountered up to this point in the Bible. There are other ancient sources that, or perhaps sources of the old world that have been translated by perhaps Enlightenment figures, such that the use of the word divers was common. But nonetheless, divers originates from the Latin word diversus, meaning turning different ways or turning in different directions. Now this suggests that the original meaning of the word divers was something that was varied and diverse or different from the norm. I'll place an underline there, different from the norm. Another thing that's important to note is the difference between the word divers and diverse. Diverse is more commonly used to emphasize the variety or difference among things, while divers is more simply used to indicate quantity. And so in general, the contemporary usage of the word divers is several or various. So again, the verse, divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Now why is this the case? Why are the various weights and various measures, both of them alike abomination to the Lord? Now I think here, initially, the distinction between diverse and divers comes into play, because I don't necessarily think that it is within the realm of differences between measures, or necessarily the measures themselves, that are the issue. It is the amount, the quantity of measure, that there is something amiss here. Now if this verse ain't a drop in the bucket, a drop of water in a bucket filled with water, I'm not sure I know what is. And I say that because it is giving us a lot of room. It is as though we are a small drop of water being dropped into a large body of water. And in such a situation, it is difficult to be oriented. If you are but one drop of water that is dropped into and among a vast sea that has potential to be droplets of their own, and even considering extending the analogy, a droplet that loses itself, loses its form, the identity of the droplet, into that of the greater whole, into the mess and mass of molecules. This loss of identity is in some sense a loss of relationality. For what was our point of origin if now the self has been diluted into this broader sea? Is the sea now the place of identity that once I, as this droplet of water, was? Well, it can't be. The sea itself is not I. I am not the sea. And so perhaps this is sort of what the verse is getting at. It is within the vast potential of measure and identification that we lose relevance, that we lose that relationality. And within relationality, we have a point of grounding. I think the self, although with it comes many dangers, has the potential for this grounding. For we remain dissimilar in some ways to that of the droplet of water. For we are so dissimilar to virtually all experience of other conscious beings on this planet, though we can relate to them in some way, some more than others. Moreover than that, the world that we find ourselves in, the structure of reality that we seem to perceive, is quite strange. Because it doesn't seem as though, to our individual conceptions, that we are droplets of water that are held above or within some broader sea, of consciousness. Now, these types of claims are difficult to make. At this point, I'm not necessarily making a claim that the way our minds work are in such a way to be within a broader structure of a conscious experience. Now, ultimately, I do have a belief and a faith that there is a consciousness that we are connected to. Its relationality, I think, is the goal, in some fashion, of faith. That is, the fine-tuning, the continual fine-tuning of the exact relationship of the individual conscious mind to that consciousness that is beyond it, but that is so beyond it that it is difficult to conceive and is difficult to maintain given one's self-identity. Now, I think that there's a lot that can be said here, and there are many thoughts that are zipping through my mind. Some of them are quite difficult to capture and to hold on to. But I think for the sake of caution and prudence, that I ought to focus on the difference here between weights and measures. Now, of these weights and measures, if we consider the property measured, that of weights we consider the force of gravity. That of measures we consider size, extent, or amount. Examples of units of different weights, we have kilograms, pounds, grams. Measures, we have meters, liters, square meters, seconds, degrees, Celsius, degrees Fahrenheit. The primary difference, it seems, that for weights there is a dependence on gravity, whereas measures there are not necessarily so. And by extension, measures is more of a general term, a broader term. It refers to the determination of the size, extent, or amount of something. Now, as is usually the case with these verses, there are a few different paths to go from here. I think in the first instance we can discuss what this means on a material level. And then I think in the second instance we can examine the broader implications of this verse as they apply to knowledge and understanding of information in general, which I have touched on to a degree with my analogy of the droplet of water and the larger body of water. But in the latter case, this would also include that type of experience and relationality that is dependent upon the human experience. And that in the former example, that of the material, we are concerned with to a degree we are concerned with purposelessness, but I think that is a misnomer, because as far as we can understand purpose and directionality, I think we can say that there is a certain directionality to the development of material concerns. I think there is a degree of difference between the development of matter, of base material, and that of organic material, and by extension, another level yet still, in terms of that intelligent life, and that of conscious and self-aware life. But when we get up to that level of consciousness and self-awareness, I think we are at scales so vastly different from that of the material that our consideration of them ought to be different, and it ought to reflect that world, whereas the material should reflect the material. So let me begin with discussing the material implications of the verse. Divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Now I'll have to admit, I initially recorded maybe 20 minutes or so of diving into the word weight, sort of as I've been doing traditionally here in my interpretation and commentary on the Proverbs. Oftentimes words and their etymological considerations have a certain utility to them. It's sort of like a key that unlocks a door for which there is much abundance. And I suppose that although I recorded that 20 minutes and I had subsequently deleted it, it wasn't entirely fruitless. However, I did run into an issue. The issue, although somewhat illuminated, has yet to be resolved. Now the issue was this, that upon discussing weight, I approached it in the matter of, in the reductionist manner, or the first principles manner, which I think in all cases, well in most cases, it is the appropriate approach to understand something. But I think what I failed to recognize is, on one hand, I think there is a certain relationship that is required in order for this first principles, well, not even that. I would say that relationality is important, as I have been discussing, but I think that there are certain fruits to this sort of jumping into the unknown, and whatever comes forth, whatever pattern emerges, it is there to be analyzed. But upon providing the example of being this drop of water that is then diluted into a larger body of water, therefore losing a sense of identity, I was unable to come to an agreeable conclusion, and I found myself sort of in a circumstance probably not dissimilar to that of a drug addict, trying to get after the next high. And that's not to say that the water drop into a larger body of water was all that intoxicating, but rather the experience itself of trying to determine exactly why various weights, and weight in particular, are an abomination to the Lord. And I felt as though I was trying to understand my conscious mind by taking a small piece of, perhaps I should say, maybe one neuron, examining its physiology really without considering anything outside of it, and trying to understand how my consciousness can exist because that thing exists. There was, in a sense, poor relationality. And still at this moment I wonder if the exploration into weight, that of discussing its colloquial usage, that of understanding its character, that it is a force, expanding from understanding what weight is, that it is some mass by some acceleration, and wrapping my mind around the two qualities that are exhibited there, that of the matter and that of acceleration, the question of what is accelerating, Why is it accelerating? Okay, we have some understanding of gravity. What is gravity? Why does it exist? In the case of the former, in case of matter, what is it? Why does it exist? I've been referring to this stuff as material that is without this conscious composition, this biological substructure. These questions, I think, are important questions. But for a number of reasons, I think of the first, examining such in-depth topics from verse 10 of chapter 20 of the Proverbs perhaps might not be the best use of time. And those matters, although they are important and are considered, I think, in this verse, in terms of depth, ought to be studied in the context of other sources. But all the same, this reductionism left me feeling as though I was a drug addict looking for a next high. And I think insofar as that first principles thinking is able to get us to some understanding, I think it can also serve as, just as I said, a potential source of confusion that is without context, without establishing proper relationships. We can find ourselves in a territory much divorced from that of true reality. It is of examining a puzzle piece without considering the rest of the pieces. And that raises all sorts of questions. But certainly, the very pursuit of first principles thinking is not it is not cause in and of itself for a word like abomination. But rather, I think, and perhaps I should say by extension, weights and measures, two things that we can examine in great detail and precision. These in and of themselves I don't think are an abomination. The key word here is divers. That is the various amounts of weights, the various measures. And when I think of something that is various, varied, many or numerous, I am forced back into the metaphor or the analogy at the outset. It is the inability of mind to interpret difference between things, to establish boundaries, to understand relationality in and of itself. And perhaps that there is a mind, perhaps there is a being that can understand the whole without getting lost in the parts. And I think the abomination is for a person to find themselves without such humility and a certain narrowness and self-centeredness that they are unable or unwilling to recognize that although they may have some procedure by which they can perceive something in greater detail or precision, they are always subject to their own limitation of mind and of experience, and as such, albeit it is not an excuse not to know or not to pursue, but it is cause for virtue. It is cause to exercise humility. Because for all of our imagination and abstraction, we remain human, we remain tied to these physical bodies, we remain in this condition on earth. And in terms of the vast potential of the material structure that we understand there to be in the universe, we are but a very, very small piece of that. Now again, I think it is important to recognize that man, I think, has an important responsibility to spread his consciousness, if you will. But I suppose the question for future analysis is, well, exactly how does he do so? Because I don't think it is an outright good for man to spread consciousness to the universe without proper care. After all, in the story of Genesis, eating from the knowledge of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, this was the impetus, this was the moment in which Adam and Eve had fallen from their state of harmony with that divinity to a state lower, and always subject to their understanding of their own limitation, perhaps relative to that which is. Now, what I find interesting here is that verse 11, the verse that is directly preceding this, even a child is known by his doings, whether his work be pure or whether it be right. Without really understanding what this verse is about, what strikes me is that the word child is in the verse after, verse 10. Because in such imaginings as that of in Genesis, and of the prompt to humility by the vast potential of information that is out there, and the lack of context that can lead one astray, there is a certain childlike existence that I think Adam and Eve exhibits in the garden. That of this naivety and unawareness. And it's a difficult thing to reconcile. For it has to be the case that, or I suppose it must be the case that man must be redeemed in some way. In some ways he has, in some ways he has yet to be. Now, I'm not going to get into verse 11 here. I'm going to end before I do so, but some remaining reflections perhaps on verse 10, divers weights and divers measures, both of them are alike abomination to the Lord. Abomination is quite a visceral, if that's the right word, impactful, powerful word. Abomination, strong. I think strong is a good word to describe abomination. It is something that is used to describe this revolt, this disgust, detestable, repulsive, loathsome. Now, if abomination is true, in some sense it is an appeal to our hearts. And I think that this is why I suggest a visceral reaction, something that is beyond the deliberate, something that strikes us rather naturally as being off-putting. And certainly within the chaotic, within the various, within the potential, as is commonly seen in symbols like in water, which on one hand it symbolizes renewal, change, but also death and destruction. Again, it is not the weights and measures, but it is divers weights and divers measures. And so I think I'm going to end this episode here and continue next time with verse 11.